All right, letting everyone in now.
Morning, everybody. We're going to give folks a few seconds to join, and then we'll start. Jillian, we still don't have the hold music that I've been asking for.
To be fair, I didn't hear that specific request. Otherwise, you would have gotten it. I'm kidding.
Good morning, Robert.
Morning, Shrikant.
I'm in my car, so I'm going to actually get off the camera.
Okay, you're terrifying all of us. So
That's okay. I'm just terrifying the people outside of the Tower Club right now. Just had breakfast with Jim Brady. Remember him?
Oh, yeah, that's great.
Yeah, he's doing great.
Good. All right. I think we hopefully we'll have others join, but let's go ahead and get started. We are recording this. Good morning, everybody. I'm Robert Shea, and delighted to be hosting this third in the series that we've been doing on trust in government, and we're delighted with the sponsorship of this work by Cherry Beckert. Shrikant Sastry leads Cherry Beckert's advisory practice. That's why, and so we're glad to have you and your support. Ed, do you want to introduce your group?
Well, first of all, I want to, Robert, thank you for inviting us, inviting the Agile Government Network to join you. And I'm going to make a small correction. I'd like to embrace Carrie's presentation last week as part of the trust discussion, because the work that that she's doing to try to change the language, the way the language works, is designed to improve trust. So I'm going to add her as the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, I believe is the way we phrase that. And in doing that, I want to give you all of you a preview. We will be reviewing and redoing some of the work at the fall meeting. There's a session at the fall meeting, I believe it's Friday morning, and we would be delighted to have all of you there. But there'll be some new forward-looking initiatives that we'll be announcing at that time. So please join us. Robert, back to you.
Yeah, it's a great addition. Thanks, Ed. And to clarify, Ed's talking about the last month's session at which Terry briefed the group on some work that they had commissioned from Frank Luntz. And really groundbreaking in my view. And the more we can get those messages out, the better. So without further ado, let me introduce our friends from the Partnership for Public Service. Lindsay Laferriere leads the partnership's trust in government work, but's also supported the partnership's work in innovation, human capital, and reaching employees outside the Beltway, all of which is directly connected to our topic today. Paul Hitlin leads the partnership's public trust in government work, and leads research for the Partnership Center for Presidential Transition. He comes to the partnership from the Pew Research Center, which, as you know, has sort of led this trust work for decades. So both of you are fantastic to join us, and we're eager to hear about the good work you've been doing in this arena, which we think is so important. So over to you, Lindsay.
Great, thank you. We're excited to be here to talk about the work that Paul and the team have been doing for 4 years. I joined this work last year, so happy to be along for the ride, but Paul's really been with it since the beginning. So as Robert said, we're here to talk a little bit about the partnership's initiative on rebuilding trust in government. We'll give you an overview of some of the research that we've been doing over the years and how the partnership's looking to address this issue. And then we are here to answer questions, engage in dialogue with you all, get your insight, etc. So the first slide we have, I think most of you are familiar with the partnership, hopefully, but we are a nonprofit organization working to build a better government and stronger democracy. We do this through a lot of ways. So we train hundreds, if not thousands, of federal employees every year through a public service leadership institute. As Robert mentioned, Paul and the rest of our team at the Center for Presidential Transition work to strengthen presidential transitions. Every year, we recognize outstanding federal employees through our Service to America medals for their contributions to our country. And we convene over 15 different networks, including the assistant secretaries for management, human capital officers, public affairs officers, and others. So there's a lot of text on this slide, but we did want to highlight a little bit the breadth of what we do here at the partnership. And we believe all of this kind of intersects in different ways with the work that we do on trust. So for today, like I mentioned, we'll give a high-level summary of our work, both the research and then the ways in which at the partnership we're trying to bridge the trust gap. We'll share some ideas that we have based on our research on how we can improve trust in government, and then would love to have a conversation with you all, what questions you have, and what ideas and feedback you see from your expertise. So I'll do one slide here on setting the stage, and then I will turn it over to Paul, who will dig into some of the findings and the interesting work. But I think, as you all know, there have been decades, we've been saying since the 60s, it's pretty consistently, trust in government has pretty consistently been going down. When we think about it from the work that we do at the partnership, we really see this as damaging to public engagement, not just in voting, which is an important component of this, but when we talk about creating a better government, having a public that is disengaged from its government, doesn't believe the government's part of the solution, also means that they're less willing to call for investment in improving government, really engage on these issues, which means you have less accountable institutions that are not meeting the needs of the public and also don't have the public engaged in solutions to make government better. So that's really the downward spiral we're seeing in trust, and why the partnership thought in 2021, this is something that we wanted to understand how to bridge, because we saw it as something that was also damaging to the mission of the organization. So with that scene setting, I will turn it over to Paul, who's going to talk a little bit about our research.
Thank you, Lindsay. I lost control of the slides for a second. Okay, so before I get into the specifics of our most recent survey, there, as was already mentioned, there are a number of organizations doing really interesting work on trust in government. There's a couple ways, there was sort of a market opening, if you will, that we saw, and one of the ways that, or a couple of ways that we can do some things that are a little bit different than some other organizations because of our positioning and our expertise. So some of the ways that we sort of see our research as different, one is we're not just looking at levels of trust, we're trying to understand what goes into those levels of trust. We're often referred to them as the drivers of trust. A big thing is that a lot of organizations, and this is not meant to be criticism, but I think it's somewhat true. A lot of organizations look at things through a political frame. They look at, they'll ask about politics, then they'll ask about trust in government, and then they move on to, other important issues of the day. So we're able or willing and interested in looking at components of the federal government beyond Congress, beyond the White House. You're looking at agencies and other things that don't get a lot of attention, and again, not using a political frame. We're not as interested in the politics as much, and so I think that's pretty unique. And then because of our mission as an organization, we're very interested in looking at opportunities to improve trust. How can we find things that will help people in government? And to borrow a phrase from a former colleague, that we're not just admiring the problem, we're actually trying to do something, hopefully, to help improve the problem. So most of what I'm going to share now comes from our survey that was conducted in March. It's a nationally representative survey of 800 people. The margin of error is 3.5 points. And we used an organization called Impact Research. So to start with, the overall levels of trust in 2022, we saw 35% there on the left said they trust the government. That's down to 23% over the past 2 years. So we're roughly 23% of the public. 63% say they do not trust the government. So this is not far from what other organizations have found, of course. And there's no real way to sugarcoat this, that trust in the government is very low, and it seems to be getting lower over the last couple of years. Just for some of the breakdowns that people are often interested in by party, Democrats are more likely to trust the government, 39%, than Republicans at 10 and independents at 19. One thing that if you look over history at the Gallup data, there's a very strong correlation between the party that's in the White House and what the public, how much the public trust the government. One thing we've found, and we've also learned to talk to other researchers, is how much people associate not only politics, but actually individuals, particularly presidents. When they think of government, they think of the president often, or they think of congressional leaders. I keep hitting the wrong button. So some of the other things, and these are, again, things that are probably not a surprise, and we can't really sugarcoat very much. So only 23% of the government, as I said, trust the government to do what is right. Only 31% believe the federal government has a positive impact. 31% believe the government has an impact on people like you that is positive. 21% believes the government listens to the public, and 35% say the government serves their community. And I'm guessing with the people on this call, none of that is a big surprise. Also, as I mentioned, what is very clear both in our work and focus groups and lots of work, when you ask people about government and federal government, they think of politics and Congress. That's where they go automatically. And so we've done a lot of work trying to get people to think a little more broadly about government and other areas of it. But when you talk to people, it's this politics and Congress, that's in the presidency, that's what they think of. And since those things are particularly unpopular, that obviously colors the whole view of government quite often. So what we have found is when you do ask people about specific components of the government that are not political, you get slightly more positive reactions, not overwhelmingly positive, but somewhat more positive. So for example, people do believe very strongly that a competent, effective and competent government is an important part of American democracy. So 95% of people agree that civil servants should be hired and promoted based on their merit rather than political beliefs. 90% say that civil servants should serve the people more than any individual president, and 69% agree civil servants should be apolitical. So there's a whole lot of support for a nonpartisan, merit-based civil service, and obviously this has come up in a number of political proposals in the campaign and elsewhere. But you see that the public overwhelmingly wants a professional, nonpartisan civil service. And not only that, they see that as a connection to American democracy. Now, a lot of people are saying that the current system, even though they wanted one system, they're not necessarily getting that. So only 45% of the public say that most civil servants can be trusted to serve leaders of both parties. 66% say there are many civil servants who work to undermine policies they disagree with, and 23% agree civil servants are nonpartisan. So the perception of civil servants, and we can hypothesize as to why that is that there are at least some that are not nonpartisan in the way that the public would want. However, trust in civil servants is higher than trust in the government overall. So overall, trust in the government is at 23%, trust in civil servants is 46%, and distrust is 32%. So it's about twice as high for civil servants than it is for the government overall. Again, going back to the idea that politics is the element that's really unpopular more than anything. There are a few additional bright spots that we like to focus on and understand a little better. One thing, we do a lot of work, as Lindsay said, talking about trying to recruit people and find ways that the government can bring good talent into the government. So we ask people, do you agree or disagree that working for the federal government is a good way for a person to serve their community? 65% agreed and did that, and only 28% disagreed. So, and you can see breakdown by parties, Democrats more so, but even a majority of Republicans and independents. So, for the people that do the workforce work, it was good to see that there's not necessarily the need to convince people the government's or not a lot of people, the government's a good way to serve. It is, people are already believing that. There are other issues involved, of course, but generally at least 2/3 of people seem to agree that it's a good way to serve. And it's actually fairly steady across demographic or across age groups. So the youngest age group slightly higher, although within the margin of error, than the other age groups. But that's good to see, since we're so, we're everyone, there's a big push to get more young people into federal service. Excuse me. There we go. Another sort of positive thing, we've seen a big increase over the last 2 years in when we ask people, do you agree or disagree that people like me or people like you work in the government? And on the right, if you see in 2024, 47% of people agreed that people like me work in the government, 40% disagreed. That's a big increase since 2022 when it was 34%. In 2021, it was 44%. So there was a dip and then an increase. We're still trying to sort of figure out why that may be. One of the good things about doing this work over time that we've been doing is we're beginning to see some trends and try to learn from that. But the fact that almost half the people in the country say that people like them work in the federal government was a surprise. I think it was a little higher than we would have expected. And we actually, if I might plug it, we actually did a blog that was released yesterday on this very thing. You can see there is a partisan difference. Democrats are far more likely to agree. But independents more agree than disagree. I keep jumping ahead. There we go. One thing that we found, and I know a lot of people here are very interested in this work, we ask about personal experiences with the government. So more people said that their personal experiences with the government have been mostly positive, 48%, than not, 44%. So not an incredibly high number necessarily, but certainly I think higher than the most common narrative you might hear in the press or in other areas. More people say that, yes, I've had mostly positive experiences. And when you ask people specifically about certain common activities, you get pretty high satisfaction rates. So of the people who accessed passport services, 77% said they were satisfied with it. Of those who went through a security checkpoint at an airport, 70% said they were satisfied. Applied for Medicare, 73%, and filed for Social Security, 70%. So, those people that have done that, pretty high approval ratings for those specific types of common activities. We did ask, we often get asked this about specific agencies. So we did ask about trust levels on specific agencies. And it's mixed. Some well-known agencies like the Forest Service, of course, are very highly thought of. Some, Social Security, HHS, have some decent trust levels. Others, IRS and State Department and Department of Education, not nearly as much. And again, we can hypothesize as to what reasons are. A lot of agencies we've asked about in the past, we only ask about agencies that are pretty well known, because a lot of people don't know much about many agencies. So there's a whole lot that we leave off for that reason. So thinking about recommendations, both through this current survey and our previous work, as I said, we'd like to try and come up with some ideas that can help people inside and outside of government, things that they can do. So some of the opportunities to build trust, of course, improving individuals' personal experiences with government is obviously important. One thing we found, and I'm drawing a blank on the specific numbers, but what we found is when you ask people about their personal experiences, 48% said, yes, most of mine have been positive. But when you ask people about the experiences that other people have had, more people think they are negative. So there's a difference between the way people say their experience has been versus their perception of others. And another way of saying it, there are a number of people who seem to think they've had good experiences, but they're somehow an outlier. And I think that perception is something that's really important to try and work on. To say that when you have a good experience, that's not the outlier. Actually, a lot of people are having good experiences. Another thing that we like to focus on, telling the stories of individual federal employees, their work and their impact on the public. As a lot of you, I think, know, we sponsor something we call the Sammy Awards every year, Sammy's Awards, which happened 2 weeks ago, I believe. That's one way that we try to highlight some particular federal employees who've done excellent work. The idea of personalization. Michael Lewis, the author, is doing some articles now in the Washington Post where he's focusing on individual people. There's something about what we found in our focus groups is that when you give examples of a person's name, their background, and the work they're doing, that helps people think more broadly about the government. And when we ask people, they sort of acknowledge sometimes that seeing that type of story makes them think more broadly about federal employees in general. Some people actually say, "Oh, I didn't realize that someone like that worked for the government." It makes me think there are other people that work like that who work for the government, and that's a really positive reaction. Lindsay put the numbers in the chat. Thank you about the personal experiences thing I was talking about. Educating individuals about executive branch agencies. A lot of education certainly needs to be done. Reminding people and teaching people that the government is not just politics, it's not just Congress, but that there are 2 million civil servants that do lots of important work that is not necessarily political. That's obviously important. And adapting the tactics and content of federal agency communications. Just as a side note, I noticed some of you may have seen the NSA just started a podcast. I think it was last week or the week before. That's sort of a surprise to a lot of people, but I think it's a good attempt to tell stories and get their message out there and the value of the work that they do. At this point, no, let me do this last one. There's a lot of text. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Some of the types of messages, I know that the Frank Luntz presentation focused a lot on these ideas. Some of the things that we found that test well, talking about the government's unique role in protecting democracy, health, and safety, national security. So, for example, the military and many civilian employees defend the country from foreign threats, while other federal government employees protect the border, prevent terrorism, and stop violent crime. That tends to test well from members of the public. As I said, personal stories are helpful, and we've seen in focus groups people sort of acknowledge a light bulb sort of moment when they see a good story about somebody. And then the nonpartisan and professional civil service get some positive responses, such as civil servants are typically experts in their field whose experience helps ensure our food, water, medications, and flights are safe. Again, also the notion of safety. So I'm going to turn it back over to Lindsay to finish us out.
This is the last slide, and then we can dive into questions. So based on all this research and the mission of the partnership, there's 4 ways in which we are working to bridge the trust gap. So the first is related to what Paul shared. We're continuing to do research on what's driving distrust, what are the opportunities that federal agencies have and people outside of government have to build trust, and how do we understand what's necessary to change this paradigm, with a bent towards what is actionable and things that can really move the needle. The second is, as I mentioned at the outset, the partnership does a lot of work with federal agencies. So we are continuing to work with agencies around what can they do differently to help change this equation. So there are actions agencies need to take to be more trustworthy and trusted, and how do we move the needle in that way? The third is around storytelling. I mentioned the Service to America medals. Paul mentioned the Who is Government series. We're continuing to find ways and try and find partners around how do we shift the narrative about government to not just focus on the horse race and politics, and really have some of the conversation be about what is government and who are our civil servants, what does government do for us beyond the policies or politics of the day. And then the last is we are building coalitions to engage others in this conversation. And we believe that government has a role to play in improving trust, but so do a lot of other actors in society, and how we talk about our government, how we talk about what our government should do for us. So we're working with higher education institutions, entertainment, other sectors to try and figure out how do they get engaged in these issues, and how do we all work together on building trust. So that's it for us. We're happy to dig into questions. Paul, I don't know if you saw Dan's question in the chat around our solutions and how improving government performance and serving the public wasn't on there. I'm happy to take that, or do you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, so I need to look to specifically what phrases we asked. We did ask some things about that, and they didn't rank as high. I will look while we're talking to see if I can find some of the numbers. I do know, as in the Frank Luntz presentation, something that he noted, which I thought was really interesting, and something we're going to look into more, was he noted that people don't seem to, they want to know the government is doing tried and true things. Innovation did not seem to test high in the work that he did or the work that he looked at. That people want to trust the government knows what it's doing, which was a bit of a surprise in some ways to me. I'll look at to see. I don't remember exact words that we looked at, but I'll look to see that. But in general, innovation and improving have not registered high in what we've looked at.
I had the same reaction, Paul, to that specific finding, that as someone who's spent 30, 40 years trying to report the performance of government, and to learn that no one gives a shit was illuminating to me. But how the stories we report, and it's fabulous that you focus on this Who is Government series, and I put some of the links to those stories in the chat. Those are very long reads, but very worth your time. So it's as you're drinking your coffee this weekend, I encourage you to open those up. But I'd also be interested to see, what more we can find out about what people do, what does really resonate with people. One question I had, Lindsay, you mentioned the work you're doing with agencies, and I know you've got this fantastic group of communicators that you assemble.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk, have you had a deep discussion on your work or the Luntz work, or basically how to communicate stuff in ways that resonate more with people, help reverse this trend? And what's the reaction? What are people doing about it?
We have. So Robert just mentioned we convened the public affairs officers from the cabinet agencies as well as some other agencies to share across the government about what they're doing. So we have had a few presentations with them about our trust work. They are very open to it and eager to learn. And I think, like many federal leaders, they also feel restrained in staffing. And the current orientation for many comms offices where they are reactive instead of proactive. So we've been working with them on how can we help provide resources or ideas for how they can flex that proactive muscle and not just be reactive to the news of the day. But I think it's an ongoing challenge that we're trying to work through with them.
It seems like it might ought to be a priority of the next administration, sort of maybe even in the president's management agenda pillar to start communicating about this better.
Paul.
So to answer Dan's earlier question, I lose track of numbers because I'm slow sometimes. But anyway, we did in the report.
You're the smartest person on the call.
Well,
Paul,
that's far too nice and not at all true. But if the report that Robert put in the chat before, I just put a chart there. We did ask people sort of what ways do you want to see the government improve the most to be more effective and trustworthy, and people were able to choose two. And using taxpayer funds more efficiently was by far the highest. Improve interactions with the public was bottom half, 11%.
Wow.
So the things that, as I said, taxpayer funds, hold employees more accountable, reduce the number of political employees, hire the best people. These are the things that people said that they want the government to work on. Now, I would add what people say and what they actually want or do are not always the same. So obviously people may not think a whole lot about their experiences and and what improvement would mean. So I certainly wouldn't mean that they're not interested in that, but at least this is what they're telling our survey. And I think I wouldn't say that the people doing this work it doesn't matter. People may not register in their minds why it matters or how important it is to them, but I would say obviously improving is really important to them, and we definitely know that poor experiences are really negative. So again, I know I don't have to convince the people on this call, but I think it's interesting that that's not what people say, but I would argue that people still find it really, really important. even if they're not answering that on a survey.
And I think some of our focus groups too, I think some of this is the public sometimes takes for granted what government does. Like they're not thinking about the ways in which government impacts their lives. So when you ask questions like this, they're focused on taxpayer money and making sure you hold people accountable rather than the things they take for granted. So that's part of the challenge of talking about trust, is what people are, like, as Paul has said before, what they're conceptualizing, what they're thinking about when you talk about government. They're often not thinking about the things that we all are talking about every day, with making sure that government operates effectively and does the things it needs to do. Ed, and then I think we can get to John's question in the chat after that.
Thanks, Robert. I wanted to take this opportunity to go back a couple of sessions to Monica Bressi and the work that OECD is doing. And for those of you who want to get up at 3 a.m., I'm not sure I'm one of them. And Dustin, you may want to plug this. There is a meeting in Milan, and I believe that's in about 3 weeks. And the meeting in Milan is the OECD recap, if you will, of where they are in trust. And historically, they've focused on competence, reliability and responsiveness, getting things done with the public money, and public values of integrity, transparency, and fairness. I'd like to suggest that we, as we do our work, keep these values in mind. Competency has been improving, and it may be a place where we can demonstrate that the effectiveness is going on. I think having the communication reflect that is good, but having the public actually see it, in whether it's in FEMA, and I think FEMA has gone up significantly, or in veterans health, which has been highlighted by the partnership historically. However, the issues of integrity are less important here in the United States, although we recently saw indictments in New York, and we also saw a change in the integrity stance of the Supreme Court. So I don't think we can forget about those as we communicate. And finally, fairness. Are people who are in equal circumstances being treated equally? So I just want to put in a plug for those. Dustin, do you want to just give us a preview? Dustin is the U.S. representative to the OECD and chairs the Public Governments Panel at OECD.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Appreciate that. Yes, so I took over to chair the committee in 2018, and that was a moment we used to identify trust as the ultimate outcome of the Public Governance Committee, and got all countries to agree to that, and then worked with Monica, who had been developing the trust survey with a few pilot kind of countries, Korea, Norway, Finland, and I kind of challenged all countries to take it and participate. We got 22 countries the first year who signed up to do that. And then we were able to get 30 countries in this latest round. So it's now something that we've committed to do every 2 years. We kind of talk about it as our PISA, equivalent to the education kind of committee work that OECD does. And each country identifies a signature initiative that they're working on to try to improve the results of their trust survey, leveraging the findings that the OECD survey provides them. There is a pretty robust deck. I think I don't know if you've received a briefing on the most recent version of it already or not, but that will be discussed in more detail in Milan, which is a follow-up to the global forum that we had in Luxembourg 2 years ago. That's another routine we've established. Every 2 years, we'll do a global forum where we invite participants from civil society as well as government officials for a 2-day session. We had a declaration that all countries agreed to in Luxembourg, and now it's a chance to show what we've been able to do delivering on those outcomes. One of the things I'm most excited about, the first ever OECD recommendation on human-centered design for public services will be finalized, which was something that I added into the Luxembourg Declaration that now we're delivering on, that takes advantage, I think, of a lot of what we've learned around how services should be designed, that has gotten consensus across all OECD countries. So that's one example, but also mis and disinformation and information integrity is another big area that they've focused on. We're seeing the effects of that in the US right now, obviously, in places like Springfield. So it's quite real. And OECD has been doing a lot of great work on that front too. So yeah, democracy, trust, those are the kind of consistent themes that we're going to keep coming back to. You will see the OECD work does also, to the partnerships point, look at drivers of trust. So they do actually kind of show which areas have the biggest influence on trust in government. One of the things from the US context, I'll just kind of plug as well, is as low as our trust scores are, our scores around does government listen to you is even lower. And I do think that is consistently a driver. One of the things that I know the OMB team, Shaibia Dalal, if you haven't met with her, that might be an area you'd be interested in learning more about. She's developing the first ever framework for public participation and community engagement in the US. And so Lauren Schulman and her are working on that. A lot of other countries are much further ahead than what the US is on having a framework for actually more consistently getting public input and using it in developing policy and informing implementation. So we're pretty far behind on that one, and it seems like an area that would be good for us to focus on. So these will be many of the themes that you'll see in the Milan Global Forum conference. Thanks, Ed, for the opportunity to put a plug in there. I'll certainly be there. I know Lauren Stockel will be there, and others, I think, from the US will be representing.
Dan, I'm sorry, Dustin, when is it?
It's the 21st and 22nd of October.
Good, and Dan Chinook will be there as well.
Yes, that's right. Dan's coming as well. I think Lauren
Great.
Schulman might be as well.
Any reaction to all that? Thank you, Dustin. And John, you put in a pretty existential question. You want to ask that out loud?
Well, the thing that struck me some years ago when I visited China was that the local governments there were trying to instill trust in their citizens. And we're, I think, making the assumption that there's a relationship between trust and democracy here. And what I'm trying to understand, I guess, is I've been seeing surveys where seems to be a distrust in democracy as a form of government in the US, which is really bothersome to me, and especially among younger people. So what I'm trying to figure out is there a message around democracy in addition to trust that we should be framing? Or I'm just wondering whether just to focus on trust and customer experience and transactional stuff gets at the bigger picture of us wanting to live in a democracy. I'm not quite sure how to frame it, but
Well, I can just say it's a very good question. We have not looked into that specifically. I have seen some similar surveys that you're talking about where democracy is not universally supported in the country the way you might think. Unfortunately, we have not jumped into that area. Our motto of the Partnership for Public Service is for a stronger democracy. So we're obviously in favor of that, but we haven't done anything separate on that specifically.
We have asked a question around how well do you think democracy is working in the US? I don't know if I can't remember if we published the results of that this year, but those numbers were also not good. So I think we found in our surveys that people don't feel like democracy is working the way that it should. But like Paul said, we have not asked, do you believe in democracy? Do you think it's the right form of government? We could potentially ask that in the future. Doug, on your question in the chat on the military, the partnership's primarily focused on the over 2 million career civil servants when we talk about the work that we do. So we have not polled recently in the military. Paul might know if we polled in 2021 on the military.
No. We have not. I think it is definitely other surveys from other organizations definitely show the military does get much higher support, as you're suggesting. I don't mean to cut you off, Lindsay. I will, although I am cutting you off. But I mean, I think it's to me, the military is a perfect example of how the distrust in government is not baked in. There are elements of the government, particularly the military, that are respected, although I think the numbers have actually gone down a little bit in recent years, but they're still much higher than the government overall. So now obviously the military is a different nature and people are committing time and their potentially safety and all that. So it's a different sort of thing. But to me, the fact that the military is supported and trusted is an indication that trust in government is possible in certain ways. You know, maybe you have to emphasize different elements of the work, but anyway, sorry, Lindsay,
I think that's all right. And I think one of our hypotheses is when you talk about, in the past, we've pulled like the National Park Service or the Forest Service. And I think sometimes it's people understand what those agencies do for them, like what value they're bringing to their lives. I think we understand what the military does for us. And that's one of our hypotheses when you talk about trust, is some of this just the public doesn't see what value government's bringing to them and how do we bridge that gap. The one other thing I'll say about the military is one of the things we do talk about at the partnership when we talk about the civil service is talking about how many veterans are members of the career civil service, to like help people understand really who makes up your government. But it's interesting thought, Doug. We have not done a lot of looking into that in our research.
Yeah, so just a couple of thoughts, and I think that's appropriate. The partnership's perspective here, I think, is fine, but I come at this from a financial management perspective, as sort of being a career budget geek. And so for me, trust in government has a lot to do with what do taxpayers get for their dollars, right? And protection, our military protection, kind of the parts of our government that you benefit from, but you don't see. There really is no customer experience involved, right? Whether it's clean air and water, hopefully, military protection, sort of the insurance blanket that we all have, that the federal government will step in the event of a crisis. Right. And that's a huge benefit. And if we're polling folks, what do you think of the federal government? You know what? The United States military is part of the federal government, and it doesn't come front of mind immediately. It might if we were at war, but in peacetime, it's an afterthought.
Yeah. Alex?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thank you for being here, for putting this on, NAPA team partnership. I think the number one thing that we all know is that government just doing better isn't enough. It needs this community to help us do better, to talk about it. So thank you, first of all. What I wanted to bring up was sort of the large amount of social science research that explains the gulf between actually doing work better and people feeling it, changing their views. In a previous life, I worked on kind of looking at democracy in post-conflict places and trying to improve the reputation of law enforcement and justice systems when you have countries coming out of civil war, kind of dictatorship regimes. And essentially, the long and the short of it is incremental changes don't do anything, because there's this mindset shift, there's confirmation bias, there's availability bias, there's the sense of the collective memory of society being anchored towards poor performance, towards things not working. And so I'm curious, what you all have seen in terms of, where we have been able to do big shifts in government. Are there any examples of agencies that have done something dramatic? In our work, it was the police don't just need to, be patrolling a little bit more or, be 10% less corrupt. You need something like new uniforms. You need something like a public campaign that's doing something really dramatic to actually kind of shift, get over that kind of hump of, oh, actually, it is a little bit different in conception, not just in kind of the day-to-day behavior.
Lindsay, Paul?
I can dare to try and answer part of that, although I think that's really interesting. We're focused on the U.S. and the the dynamics there are somewhat different than many other parts of the world. One of the reasons why we're doing this work is most of the work that I've seen in terms of political communication or in terms of how people form opinions is based on politics and is based on how people vote, which party they vote for, maybe their position on certain issues. So I think that's one of the gaps that we're trying to fill, is not just how does that impact their vote, but how does it impact their view of the EPA or other things. The one example I know that we often bring up, a lot of people do, is the VA. The VA went through a really dramatic increase in trust over the last decade or so. I know there's a lot has been written about that. It was obviously a lot of work over a lot of time and very hard and costly to do it, but they had some success. The only thing I can add, and this comes from talking with various government leaders, is the importance of showing up repeatedly. That's what a lot of people talk about. Is anyone can show up once, but showing up that second time and that third time and showing you're committed is something that is essential to get people to trust you. And it seems obvious when you say it, but that, nothing, I think that's what you're saying. I don't know that anything one time is going to really change people a lot. It's when you're coming back and showing differences where they may start to change their opinions, hopefully. That's as wise as I get on that question. That's a really tough, good question.
But it
And I don't
sounds
have
like,
anything. Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
I was just going to say, it sounds like some evidence agenda attention should be focused on filling what you call the gulf, Alex.
Yeah, and I think that's why we're encouraged that OMB is now doing all of this measurement on trust. Like, hopefully we will be able to see in the future what other agencies are seeing dramatic increases and what did they do? Because right now, from what we've found in our research, VA is the one example we can hold up, an agency that was focused on these issues, was doing work and was tracking it. So thrilled that you all are doing more measurement around trust, because I think it does help us identify bright spots where they exist and identify what it was those agencies did to move the numbers.
And I think, Alex, we've got some case studies in flight right now at IRS and Social Security. Those are two significant transformations going on that we ought to see what impact those are having on perception of those agencies. And I know Danny in particular, or the IRS commissioner in particular, wants to transform the way people view the IRS, which is right now a punchline, right? So he wants to transform the perception that people have to something that's actually trusted and respected, rather than that punchline. So, Stephen.
Yes, thank you. One, I appreciate Alex's comments about human behavior, because one of the things I think we all recognize is that when people share experiences and they tell the stories, and this goes back to what Paul was talking about, like, well, how come these people are telling us that their friends are telling them about negative stories, but they have a good experience, or relatively good, but the only stories they hear from their friends is the bad experiences. And as we know, you love to tell that story. You got that story, and it's typically the horror story. So even if you've had 90% success, it's that one time out of 10 or whenever that sticks out like a sore thumb. Literally, I mean, we use that term. It's sore thumb. It's only one of the thumb. It's only one of the fingers, but it's the one that gets all the attention because it's that negative experience. And that has a lot to do with human nature, I guess, to avoid the bad things more than accentuate all the good things. And so, and this is common, of course, in any kind of, outside of government as well, right? And you usually go, a lot of times I do that. I'm just saying, when I look at the surveys and you get the 5 stars and the 4, I do go to the 1 stars, because I want to find out the horror, whatever you do, don't do this. And the thing that I like to see sometimes, the provider or the supplier, whomever, they'll actually respond to the 1 stars and say, tell us all about it. Here, we want to know what went wrong. And that gives to me a lot of credibility, the idea that, okay, stuff goes wrong. and we want to know why so we can make it better. That's the kind of relationship, in any kind of relationship with people, family, friends, that where they listen and they want to understand you. And I think that was one of the, on one of the slides was one about, does government listen to me? And to me, that is the thing that often is supposedly captured a lot more in the pulse surveys that Dustin worked on. That says, oh, did they listen to you? Do you feel heard? And I think that was one of the drivers. To me, the idea is that you can't trust somebody if they're not listening to you. And if they've consistently pretended to listen to you, makes it even worse.
Mhm.
They've done that on a consistent basis, then it's like, no, they're not listening. They're not looking out for me. So just wanted to point out those things. Thank you.
Yeah. Lindsay, Paul, you have a reaction to that?
Well, I would just say quickly, and yeah, Stephen, thanks. One of the things Lindsay mentioned that we're trying to do is also build coalitions. I think one of the many reasons why this is so hard is that there are things beyond the government's control, including the media and popular media and news and all kinds of other things. So we've actually done some work trying to work with journalists and even some people from Hollywood and talk about the role that they play in telling stories and the importance of telling a variety of stories. For people in government, obviously, there's only so much you can do about that. But that's one of the many reasons why this is such a complicated subject. That even if the government gets everything right tomorrow, that may not be enough. With so many other factors involved that are really, really challenging. Yeah,
one of the things I note, and that I know the partnership was involved in, the G word. This was the comedian Adam Conover hosted, Obama produced series on deep dives into certain government operations, one of which was the FDIC. They did a great story on how that organization, furnishes the financial infrastructure of the United States. And then FDIC goes and screws things up by having this horribly toxic culture. And that's a much sexier the story than how well the FDIC is doing at shutting down bad banks or saving bad banks. Anyway, it's an uphill battle. That's why we're all in this, though. We're all in this together. Dustin?
Just to build off of Stephen's comment, it does seem like we need to kind of work on both the extremes, both lifting up the positive examples, but also being honest about the negative interactions. I mean, the research shows, right, that the negative interactions that people have matter 9 times more than a positive one. And I've been really disappointed that I can't go and find a list of where those most negative kind of interactions are occurring across government. I don't know. You tell me, does it exist?
Well, that sounds
Where
like
would
a
you
great
go?
project. Great. It's
like,
sort of,
and I think the Frank Lutz's research and Don Kettle's, kind of follow-up piece, kind of really solidified that, being honest about where those things are happening and attacking them, defining them would be a great place to start. I don't know where to go to get those. I don't think I've seen that from GAO.
My wife had an idea of
Okay.
a YouTube channel where you could post a recording of your customer experiences. And her motivation was a experience I was having with a federal agency. That was a disaster. And that's sort of a tongue-in-cheek way to go about it. But I do think it would get attention.
Well, we can wait till Anderson Cooper does it, like they did on SSA, or John Oliver has done it for SSA, if you caught that on Monday or Sunday night. So, there are people out there who are documenting it. Those are just 2 examples for our agency. But I don't really see anyone else doing it in kind of a comprehensive way that really defines our problems. And that there seems to be a little lack of rigor and honesty about where the challenges exist.
But it's also has to be really
what I can
thoughtfully
tell.
done. Has to be really thoughtfully done, right? Because it could be a partisan could easily turn into a partisan thing.
Possibly.
Yeah.
I don't know. It just having now seen a leader like O'Malley come in and own problems
Right.
and not be defensive about them has really begun to shift the culture, at least among the leadership team. And I've seen that transition. You know, I, for instance, get all the IG reports and the historical reaction of the SSA leadership team is to push back on all the findings. And it's amazing how quickly they're willing to acknowledge that, oh, yeah, this is actually a problem and we should do something about it. Like if just given a little bit of space to say, no, it's okay. We understand. It's going to take budget. It's going to take time. It's going to take resources, but that doesn't mean the findings are wrong. We should own them, right? And it's just even, it's amazing how much I think the built-in culture of many of our agencies is to resist and push back on identification of problems versus acknowledge them, which is the first step to actually working on them.
Yeah. Amanda.
So this is kind of in line with some of the conversations as Terry and I have been going to different venues and rolling out the words that work in the Frank Luntz material, talking about the role of the oversight community, the critical role that GAO and the IGs play. However, you know, you can also see where you're highlighting something that's a deficiency or an area for improvement, and then that's taken out of context and used to beat up on the agencies on the Hill. And it seems in line with your conversation, Dustin, about if agencies acknowledge challenges and then take steps to address them, that's maybe more productive than just simply pushing back against the findings of the GAO and the inspectors general. But is there a way that we can improve that relationship? Obviously, you want to maintain independence, but I think I spent 9 years at the Government Accountability Office, and I always came at it from, I'm not here to, I never want to find something that's grossly negligent. I never wanted to find a deficiency. If we find one, we'll highlight it. But it was always about making government work better, more efficiently, more effectively. And how do we communicate that in partnership with each other rather than having it be a got you, or then it's a Hill series of hearings, and then it's, you know, beating up on the agencies, and it creates this tense relationship.
Great point.
I don't know
And
if
I'd also
this,
challenge
Yeah,
some
go
of the extent to which, if you do look at what some of the GAO findings are, for instance, right now, are those really aligned to where some of the biggest problems are? That would make a difference on things like trust.
Lindsay, you were gonna say
Yeah.
something? Yeah.
well, yeah, just that I don't know that this applies to GAO, but one of the things we've been working on is, I don't know if folks are familiar with the Solutions Journalism Network, but it's a movement around how do journalists talk more about the solutions and what's working right, and as the center of their story, not just reporting on what's going wrong. And we've been working with them on a new building democracy fellowship, where they have 15 newsrooms who are reporting on government. And I think part of what we're hoping through work like that is, how are journalists talking about, maybe it's not all the way there, but how are government agencies trying to solve problems? And like, how do you talk about that as the story, and not just here's the way in which government failed to do something, but what are the solutions they're working towards? So I don't know that makes sense for GAO, but that's one thing to offer. The other thing I was going to mention related to the past conversation about how do you own problems. So we are getting ready to release some new research on 18 to 34-year-olds and what's driving some of their distrust. And one of the things that we learned through focus groups, and there was a real emphasis that they wanted to hear, not just we, the government, accomplished X, but we accomplished X, and we know here are the 5 other things that need to be resolved. That they wanted a lot more acknowledgement of the context of the problem, or what's not working well, as opposed to just the good news, which is probably not surprising to anyone that that's more of where the appetite is. But we did some message testing too, and that came through not just in what they said they wanted, but in what message resonated best with them.
And I wanted, Lindsay is always one step ahead of me. I was going to say something similar. I think what we learned also from talking to some of these folks is there's a distrust of anything that looks too glossy or that looks too finished or too perfect. They just don't trust it. My favorite finding of that was they really don't like stock photos and stock video, which and they notice it. But there was a lot of talk about authenticity, and they just anything that seems too polished, they just ignore. And I think, you know, that makes some sense. You know, they don't necessarily, they just feel like they're being lied to or misled or whatever. And so some honesty, acknowledging the challenges, I think, is really hard, and you're all communicating why that is so difficult, but it might also get people to pay more attention if they feel like it's more honest and thorough.
Yeah. Hey, Robert, could I follow up on my
Yeah.
wise crack in the chat? So when we were talking about, you know, places where government doesn't work, you know, if you had a time travel machine and went back to, you know, this isn't federal government, but DMVs back in the day got a reputation for being a nightmare, right? I thought it was so interesting. I think it was yesterday. My daughter, who just got her first adult license, came in and said, I just went to the DMV and it was amazing. I went right through it, but she was sort of implying that she understood that DMV was a nightmare scene and she had this positive experience. So I think once you lose trust, it can last decades, right? It's really difficult to restore lost trust.
Yeah. Other questions, comments? Lindsay, Paul, thank you so much. This is fantastic. It really contributed to the conversation significantly, and we're proud to be associated with your work.
Thank you for having us.
We're counting on you. So next year it's going to be a totally different story, right?
It's the danger of doing this work is when Paul was sketching out a report this year. He's like, I don't know what the good news is here. But we did find a few places where there were some promising signs. But thank you all for the work you're doing. Thank you for having us. If folks do have any questions after this, we're always happy to chat.
Wait, Alex is keeping us one more question.
Exactly. Not a question, just kind of an open call. So I'm the President's Management Agenda Strategy Lead here over at GSA. We're in the process of thinking through like what the hell we can do for the next President's Management Agenda as we're revising the new administration. So just an open call to reach out with bold ideas, crazy ideas, things that are just so crazy they might work. So please reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. Most of y'all probably have it. But thanks again for all you guys are doing on the outside to help us do better, smarter things on the inside. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Appreciate it. And good luck. Everybody have a great weekend. Take care.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks so much.